debate, and big money is controlling it.
Well, the question was about the climate movement, and I agree with what Scott's saying. We don't want to have a situation where there's a false wind and the wind goes out of the sails, but I think we're in a situation where we've had a decade of continual failure, and my sense is that people who are concerned about climate change have by and large switched off, because we've had failure with the CPRS, and that split the organised side of the climate movement. We've had failure at Copenhagen, and it's demoralising, and people are just sort of thinking, I'll just focus on something else, because this one is so demoralising. I think we do need something positive. I think that this is something positive, something that people can get behind. Of course it's not enough. Of course, we're going to have to keep moving on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. We're going to have to keep doing that for 2 decades. Let's face it, we're going to need to keep campaigning for continuous reform for decades to come if we're going to solve this problem. But we do need some sort of a win, because I feel in the constituency of the Conservation Council and people that are concerned about the environment generally, they're just switching off to climate change because we've had so many failures.
I've got Richard and then Robin.
Piers, I was really interested in your comment that you made. Our democratic processes are paralysed by the power of big business. Can you tell us a bit more about how that is done, and how might we overcome this so that the deliberative capacity of the state is enhanced to deal with this very urgent issue that we have?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Of course I don't have all the answers, but the reason why I sort of put that view forward was because I was asked to speak at an event in the lead up to CHOGM, which was about the civil society sort of input into the Commonwealth process, and it occurred to me that the best thing that the CHOGM could do was to restore democracy, because democracy is broken all around the world. We've got this huge people's movements in support of taking radical action on climate change, really, and yet all around the world democracies have failed to deliver that. And Copenhagen's been an example, and the Australian democratic process is a good example as well. I think that it's explained by the fact that there's been this approach around the world to deregulate the corporate sector and to cede power to the corporate sector from governments, and the corporate sector now have collectively far more financial might than governments, and they can manipulate the democratic process through the use of that financial might. I don't think that that's going to be solved easily, but I think that it needs to be. It does need to be addressed, and there's a role for all sorts of different policy reforms, including regulating the role of these companies in the political process, regulating their ability to advertise, and also fundamentally changing the way that, if you look at the Corporations Act in Australia and other places, if you're a member of a board of a corporation, you're actually legally obliged to pursue the interest of your shareholders and to pursue profit, even if that is at the expense of the public good. And so we've got a legal system which actually pitches our corporations against the interests of the public.
So then you have corporate responsibility about sustainability and so forth.
Well, I think that the corporate responsibility is part of it, but that doesn't going to solve the problem either. There's a whole suite of reforms that are required to rein back the power that corporates hold in countries like Australia. I'm not an expert on how this is going to be done, but geez, we've got to tackle it.
I was just going to add, I think the United States is the real shining example. We had the global financial crisis, which, so after all this deregulation, the whole economy, the world economy collapses, and all that's happened is capital has just regrouped. No one's being charged with anything. You've got workers in America, unemployed workers, living in tents now. That's what it's down to. And it's business as usual. So the taxpayer took on the burden of all these losses, So now we've got all these countries with these massive debt problems, which were brought on by the banks. The banks have got away with it scot-free. They have been rewarded for collapsing because we'll bail them out every time because they're too big. You know, they talk about Italy being too big to collapse, but
if you look at some of these countries and economies that have bailed out their financial sectors, it's impossible to distinguish whether you've got state-run banks or bank-run states, because there's been such a massive transfer of capital from the public sector back into the private sector in order to bail it out because of the problems in failing to regulate it in the first place. That's really scary to me. I mean, I can't differentiate that, and I think that's a major impediment to dealing with something like climate change.
So Scott, what do we do with governments that support corporate interests?
Right, I'm going to chuck a hand grenade into the middle of the room and see who jumps on it. We've got for the first time in modern history, arguably, a centre-left coalition, if you will, or an uneasy, fractious, bitter alliance, okay, of parties that don't particularly get along. And I'm no fan of the Labor Party. I don't get up in the morning and campaign for them. They do some things that make me despair. But this is a government that in the last 18 months or so, going back into the Rudd period, has picked a fight with the mining industry over tax, newspapers over the campaign that Murdoch's running against us at the moment, gambling industry, the tobacco industry, and the carbon mafia. Now, you could say they've tried to come up with accommodations with each of those sectors, and you could say they didn't go hard enough. But these are fights that have been picked. And the outcome is they've got polling down into nearly single figures. And they're being painted as being this disastrous, incompetent, stupid, pick your mode of analysis or just pick up the Australian, if you will. And there's this kind of, the tempo and the language of political discourse has become really violent. It's become around hating these people and wanting them gone. And Abbott's just surfing that wave. So I think we're not having this debate in a vacuum. We're having it in the context of a government that, however feeble you might call it on some issues, has picked the fight. And we've done our best to put some strength into its backbone. Our polling's doing fine. People who voted for us reckon they really got their money's worth. But I think at some point we've got to pile in behind these people and acknowledge the fights that have been picked. Because it's not going very well. It's not going very well. They roll a prime minister. The mining companies chucked $22 million into the pot and rolled a prime minister and saved them something in the order of between $60 and $100 billion over 10 years on that tax.
The same mining companies removed President Zelaya in Honduras.
Right, at least it wasn't done with a bullet.
Yeah.
So that's one.
Just on that point there, in today's Australian, it has said that there is a window now of opportunity for the ALP to get rid of the Greens. Have you seen that?
I just have to hold that thought for a minute, Richard, because we'll just move on to see if Alex wants to back up the grenade.
I can see why people, why you could sort of present a common sense argument that governments have lost power to corporations. Corporations are obviously very powerful, but I think it is still the case that the problem is not that corporations are more powerful than governments. I think governments are more powerful than corporations. The problem we've got is that corporations have captured the governments, and what we need is we need the people to capture the governments back, so that we can genuinely pick the fights and win them.